So your Lenten penance is almost coming to an end, another hour or so, and then you will have paid your dues for Lent. We're going to talk about conversion, as David mentioned. And let me just start with a quick story. A movie you may have seen. It came out, I think, in the mid to late 80s. It was called Moonstruck. And Cher was the star of the movie. She plays the daughter in this Italian family in Brooklyn. And the movie is a romantic comedy about all the various interactions of the members of the family with their in-laws, potential in-laws, neighbors, and the like. And there's a scene in the movie that's always stayed with me, and I've always found a sort of interesting little scene in the movie. It happens a ways into the movie, and by now it's become obvious to the audience that Cher's mother, who's played by Olympia Dukakis, Governor Mike Dukakis' sister, she plays the mom, and she and her husband are in a marriage that is become maybe not lifeless, but certainly sort of lacking any sort of passion or energy. It's pretty much become a fairly dull routine between the two of them. They eat in silence often. There's not much conversation going on. And it becomes apparent that after a while, Olympia Dukakis is wondering, is her husband seeing someone else? Is there an affair? But there's just a general sense between the two of them that somehow this marriage is not ending up the way one would have liked. And the one scene is her husband's out one evening and she doesn't want to bother cooking for herself. So she decides to go out to dinner by herself to a local neighborhood restaurant. And she goes to the restaurant, and it's just a simple place, nothing fancy. And they seat her at a table for one, and she's sitting there. And suddenly another fellow comes in, and he's by himself, and the waiter seats him at the nearby table to hers. And they're just sitting there and they're ordering their food, and a mild conversation starts up. Oh, do you know this place? What do you recommend in terms of food? And they're just kind of having a friendly banter back and forth. And as the food arrives, he says to her, gee, would you mind if I just moved over and sat with you at the table and during dinner? And she says, no, that'd be fine. So he moves over, and the two of them are there, and they have their dinner, and they have conversation, and it's at most it's mildly flirtatious, but she's just flattered that there's a man paying some attention to her and listening to a conversation with her. And the end of the dinner, he offers to pay for the meal, and she says, no, that's not necessary. He said, well, you live around here. I'll make sure you get home. I'll walk you home. So they walk home to her house, and they're there, and it's a brownstone in Brooklyn, and they're at front of the stoop. And he says, well, gee, thank you so much. This was really a lovely evening. He says, oh, no, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was very pleasant. Hope you enjoy your visit here. And then he says, would you mind if I came up for a cup of coffee? And she says, no. And the fellow who actually is the actor is John Mahoney, who was Frasier's father. If you saw the TV show Frasier, the guy who played Frasier's father, he says, well, I just thought we had a lovely evening, and I just thought maybe I'd come up. And she said, no. He said, well, why not? And she says, because I know who I am. And I think in many ways, that's the heart of the matter for what I'd like for us to reflect upon tonight in terms of conversion. To know who you are. Dave, if you'd go to slide 1 in the PowerPoints. Know thyself This was the motto of the famous Greek philosopher Socrates: to know who you are, to know thyself. And the reason why that's important is you have to have some sense of who you are in order to know how you should act, in order to know what are the values that you hold dear, in order to know what direction do you want to go in your life. You need to have a sense of the self if you're going to really sort of steer your life in a conscious and intentional way. And if we're unclear about our identity, if we don't know who we are, then our behavior becomes sometimes wildly inconsistent, because who I am with you then becomes very different than who I am with somebody else. And I might be very different with a third person. And because I don't know and I have no anchor in my sense of self, I just wind up becoming somewhat chameleon-like and taking on the identity or the personality that the person I'm with expects of me or wants me to be. Now, the word conversion actually comes from the Hebrew word shuv. And the Hebrew word has a very practical, down-to-earth meaning. If you were walking along a road going towards Jerusalem, and you saw a sign pointing saying Jerusalem back there, and you turned around, you were just engaged in shuv. To shuv meant to sort of reverse one's direction, to alter one's path. When that Hebrew word got translated into Greek, it became metanoia. And metanoia in Greek also had a similar everyday meaning. It wasn't a religious word. Metanoia was, gee, I used to think this was the most important thing in life. And then after I had that heart attack or after my spouse died, all of a sudden I realized this is what's most important, not that. That's metanoia. Metanoia is really to change one's mind about something, to have a conviction and then to alter that conviction. And then when those terms got translated into the Latin, they were translated as the Latin term conversus, which simply in Latin means to turn around. So that the words used for conversion have always had, on the one hand, a sort of spatial connotation, that it has something to do with redirecting one's life, or in the case of metanoia, rethinking one's life. And I just want to spend a little time reflecting upon what is this thing we call conversion, and how does it apply to our religious identity and our moral identity. Now, one of the things that's true about a converted self, a self that undergoes redirection or undergoes some sort of change of thinking or change in values, is that whether you think of it as changed belief or attitudes or orientation, the self is what I'm going to call an enduring self. And what I mean by that is, remember our conversation 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago when we talked about basic freedom. And I suggested to you that the basic freedom is this ability to determine oneself, to fashion a self over the course of our lives. A sense of oneself that stresses the newness of each moment, that every day is the first day of the rest of your life, and tomorrow is a brand new beginning again. To talk that way about how we transform ourselves is really to have no sense of the continuity of the self over the course of days and time. That our personal character, our sense of self, really spans a whole array of individual choices and decisions, and it undergoes change very gradually. We are not simply created anew each day. So we need to be sober about the possibilities of conversion. Now, that notion cuts two ways. Conversion is not just any good deed or any good act that I do. Conversion really is about a change of the self. And conversion calls forth transformation of that basic freedom. It calls for us to really think about what is our fundamental orientation towards God. In this sense, conversion really can't be achieved by any single good deed. Conversion takes place on a deeper, more personal level, where a man or a woman is really able to shape themselves. And such a disposition of really shaping the self, it's not possible to always engage basic freedom on a daily basis. It takes place over time. So conversion ordinarily takes time. There was a very famous moral theologian in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who was very influential at Vatican II. His name was Bernard Häring, and he was a German and a theologian and a Redemptorist priest. And Häring, I was in his presence a number of times. He was a very, very impressive, very saintly man. One of those people who just sort of, you meet him and you just look into his eyes and there's a sort of transparent goodness about him and a certain holiness about him that just was obvious when you spent time in his presence. But Häring, when he would lecture priests, he used to always talk to them about the law of growth. And what he meant by that was, you take people where they are, and you do not lay impossible burdens on people's backs about conversion. You don't simply say to somebody, oh, you can hardly walk. Tomorrow, I want you to run a mile. Instead, what you do is you ask somebody, hey, why not go outside tomorrow and just take a nice leisurely stroll around the block? And then maybe a little later you say, why don't you try walking several blocks? And then after a while you say, why don't you try and walk a little faster and pick up the pace? Or perhaps don't walk on level ground, try and walk up a hill. And then eventually you might suggest, hey, have you ever thought of trying to jog part of the way? Walk some and jog a little bit. And maybe over the course of time, that person will be able to run a mile. But they can't run a mile on the first day. And Häring used to always say to priests, don't burden people by ignoring the law of growth. People undergo conversion over time. You don't want to leave people where they are. You want to invite them to grow. Ask them to get up and move and shuffle their feet a little bit. But you don't go from being sedentary to running the Boston Marathon. You give people time to develop and change and evolve. A second aspect is not only that the self endures over time and therefore changes over time, is also that the self is on a quest. And this is the other part of the law of growth. People do have to grow. You don't leave people where they are. You invite them to move, to change, to develop. And so in a real sense, you and I are all on a quest. There is a certain sense that we all know, I am not all that I should be. I am not yet the person I would hope to be or would like to be. We all have some awareness of the human predicament. that all of us fall short in one way or another, and that the questing self is someone who doesn't give up on themselves and the possibilities of change. When I was a kid, growing up in Brooklyn, there was a very popular cartoon show. I don't know if you had it up here in Albany or in Boston, if Dave saw it, but it was Popeye cartoons with Captain Jack McCarthy, I think the guy's name was. And the character Popeye in the cartoons, uh, he would at some point or other get into some discussion with Olive Oil or Bluto or one of the other people. And his saying was, I am what I am, and that's all that I am. And I want to suggest to you that's exactly the wrong motto to have for oneself. Years later, I became a big fan of Garrison Keillor, the radio comedian who used to host the Prairie Home Companion and would tell these stories about his fictional hometown, Lake Wobegon. And he used to say that the town motto was Sumus quod sumus, which translates as, we are what we are. And I want to suggest to you that to think in those terms is to lose a sense of the quest, to lose the sense that who I am right now, what we are right now is not enough. It's not good enough. There's still time for growth. There's still a need for development. Each of us can look at our lives and see spaces where I need to keep changing. I need to keep growing. And one of the real risks in the moral life is what the medieval monks used to talk about when they talked about acedia in Greek. In Latin, it got translated as sloth. It was one of the capital sins. Some of us remember when we used to talk about capital sins. And the idea of sloth, properly understood, was not today, we think of the person who's slothful as, well, that's a person who's physically lazy, right? The image, the guy who's sleeping in the hammock while somebody else is mowing the lawn. We think that's sloth. But that's not what the term meant when they talked about it as a capital sin. Instead, the idea of sloth was we give up on the quest. We give up on ourselves, on changing, on evolving, on developing. And we become satisfied with, I am what I am, and that's all that I am. That is to lose that sense that all of us are called to continuous, ongoing change and development and growth. And one of the real dangers the medieval tradition suggested was that all of us can settle for mediocrity. It becomes comfortable. It becomes easy to just stay with the status quo. And what the moral life entails and what conversion asks of us is to go on the quest, to not give up on ourselves, and to believe that we're still capable of change and development. The third characteristic of a converted self is that that self is free. And we've talked about this already, and I won't belabor it. But it's just the idea that you and I are not simply determined by our past. Sure, our families, history, our parents, siblings, teachers, our neighborhoods, the education we've got, all these things have an influence on us. All these things shape and mold us, but they don't simply determine us. You and I are free. We are capable of still having some decision-making capacity about the kind of person I want to be. I may not be able to change my height. I can't change my skin color. I may not be able to grow more hair, But I can ask myself, what kind of moral character do I want to have? What kind of values do I want to hold close? What kind of behaviors do I want to exhibit? I still am free to make choices along those lines. So that's the whole point. If there was no ability to be self-determining, if all talk of freedom was just a mirage, well, then there's no point in talking about conversion. And indeed, there's no point in talking about the moral life. If it isn't a matter where I have some ability to make choices and decisions and be held responsible for them. If it's all somehow written in the stars or all somehow determined for me by fate or kismet, well, then we're not talking about morality anymore because we're not talking about freedom. Conversion is a process. One visit to an AA meeting does not indicate the achievement of sobriety. We can all have inspired moments which call us to change. But oftentimes, after some initial fervor and energy for change, we fall back into familiar patterns. We fall back into the familiar ways of relating to other people in our lives. We have to be able to undergo a process. An example of this: how does a child who is actually an orphan, how does an orphaned child come to think that these two non-biologically related people to me are my mother and father? How is it that I come to think of these people who are not my birth parents actually are my parents? What happens in the process of adoption that the child growing into the adult comes to see him or herself as, I'm their son or I'm their daughter? It's because as children, we do not really have an identity of which we are aware. Rather, our identity is really external to ourselves. What I mean by that is, my identity lives in the imagination of other people. That is, those who have been entrusted with being my guardian bring me up, and they have an image of me as their child. And so they treat me as their child. And after a while, because that's how they treat me, I come to think of myself as, I'm their child. And whether they realize it or not, they are really projecting their image of me onto me. I am what they think I am. So after time, the infant who's adopted comes to see herself as, I'm the daughter of these people, even if they are not really her biological parents. It's why, of course, adolescence is such an awkward time for many of us, because adolescence is often a time of identity crisis. All of you who've had children know that painful moment when all of a sudden, maybe you're walking down the street or you're in public with one of your kids, and you see this group of other kids coming towards you, or you're walking towards them. And suddenly you find that your daughter or son starts lagging behind you. They put some physical distance between you and themselves. All of a sudden, they're not interested in holding your hand or talking with you. And you begin to realize, this kid is embarrassed by me. This kid does not want to be seen in public with me. And you begin to realize that at a certain point in life, for your child, his or her peers means more to them than you do. And this is the painful experience, you see, of adolescence, that all of a sudden I knew who I was because I was the child of these parents. But now I'm also the classmate of these people. I am the teammate of these people. I'm the best friend of that person. I'm the student of that person. And after a while, you begin to realize that the teenager is going through an identity crisis, trying to figure out in all these different relationships that I have, who's the real me? Is the real me who I am with my parents? Or do I kind of put on an act when I'm with my parents? And the real me is who I am with my friends, or who I am with my coach, or my teacher, or someone else who's significant in my life. That's a very natural, if painful, experience, sometimes both for parent and for child. That the child is going through a period where they're trying on all kinds of different hats to figure out which hat really fits. Who am I really? And it's one of the things I see on college campuses, that suddenly a kid has friends at school that may be very different than the friends they have back home. And who they are with those two different groups of peers may be quite different. And who they are with their parents and who they are when they're on campus away from their parents can be very different. And that can be painful if the discrepancy between the different identities becomes too large. After a while, it's hard to know who the real me is. So if we go to slide 2, Dave. So when we look at this religiously, in terms of religious identity, a Catholic family treats their child as a Catholic, addressing the child as one who is Catholic. In time, that identity is not only how the parent thinks of the child, we're raising our son or daughter to be Catholic, but after a while, the child begins to think, oh, I'm a Catholic. So part of my self-identity is I'm Catholic. But you can see there's a problem with this kind of socially induced religious identity. Am I Catholic because I think I'm Catholic? Or am I Catholic because that's how other people treat me and think of me? I may not be clear about myself and my self-identity. God may have been important to me in my early years as I struggled to find myself, as I try to locate myself in the world. But once that's done, what role does God play for me as I begin to move into adulthood? As an adult, I can't go on forever ignoring the fact that my commitment to God was really made to happen for me by the actions of other people. My parents told me I was Catholic. They brought me up Catholic. The adult believer comes to see the commitment to God is not really my commitment. Rather, the commitment to God is something that other people wanted me to have. And so in a certain sense, I somewhat uncritically and unreflectively take on a religious identity, but it may or may not be the real me. And so eventually you may find an adult who is sort of drifting in a religious wasteland, no longer prepared to accept as part of their mature identity the idea of themselves they had from their parents. Just as I am no longer daddy's little girl or Mama's little helper, why should I be Catholic? Is not that their image of me also that I have grown out of? I think that makes sense of the multitude of people we have met in our lives who will say something like, well, I was raised Catholic, but I don't practice anymore. The question to ask is, were such people ever mature Catholics? Or did they simply, at some point, shake off their parents' image of them as Catholic? Because being Catholic never was really part of their self-image that they made their own. Is it not the case for each of us that at some point in our lives, you and I realized that if I'm going to think of myself as a Catholic, it can't be simply because my parents raised me this way? That at some point, I have to make a commitment to Jesus on the belief that, yes, I want to be your disciple. This relationship with Jesus of Nazareth matters enough to me that I want to make that part of who I am. So what I'm proposing is that to be an adult believer, a second conversion needs to take place. God must enter my life in a new way, not in the former way of a socially induced identity as Christian, but the adult believer must experience a very personal discovery of who is God for me, and not simply take on the identity that others would socialize me into. In the context of the Catholic Church, which practices infant baptism, this second conversion tends to be looked upon as a ratification of the first conversion of baptism. We might think of it as a deepening of the faith that we already possessed, or as a stirring up of faith that had been somewhat dormant, or the evolution of faith that was there in seed, but really hadn't yet matured and ripened and blossomed. For many of us, though I'm not saying for all of us, but for many of us, is that not your own experience of moving from childlike to adult faith? That you are here because of your faith, not because you're trying to live up to your parents' faith or your parents' image of you. So we might suggest that the true religious conversion involves a personal appropriation of the faith that was formally projected onto me by the socialization process of being raised in a Catholic family. In other words, I now personally make my own my identity of myself as a Catholic Christian. It's an identity others first gave me, but now the gospel story becomes my story. David, we'd go to slide 3. It is in a parallel sense that I'd like to talk then about moral conversion. I'm going to suggest to you that moral conversion is a personal appropriation of values. That is, I live by values that I believe in. They're not just the values of my parents, not just the values of my society, American society. It's not just even the values of my church, the Catholic Church. It's my values that I try to live by. In other words, each of us comes to some moment, and what I mean by moment, I don't mean an instant. I'm talking existentially a moment, which may last for weeks, months, or even years when we go through this process. But each of us comes to a point in time when we realize it's up for us to decide for ourselves, what is it we want to make of ourselves. It's possible to distinguish here two moments of conversion. One that I'm going to call uncritical conversion, and the other critical conversion. I mistyped that up there. Excuse that typo that I passed on to Dave. It should be conversion as uncritical and critical, not the second uncritical. What do I mean by uncritical moral conversion? This is the movement that almost all people go through. Not everybody, perhaps, but almost all people who mature go through the stage. It's the movement from what we might call self-satisfaction to value. That is, when we're very young, we tend to do what we do in order to feel good about ourselves. So I do this because if I do this, my father will tell me what a good boy I am. If I do this, my mother will smile at me and tell me what a wonderful child I am. If I do this, my teacher will congratulate me or compliment me. If I do this, my grandparents will say how proud they are of me. In other words, I'm living and acting in a way that wins me things that make me feel good about myself. That's what I mean by self-satisfaction. I'm a pleaser. I do what I have to do to please other people so that they will praise me. They'll honor me. They'll look up to me. They'll give me what I want for Christmas. I'll get good birthday presents or whatever it may be. But eventually, we move beyond that and we begin to make choices based not on self-satisfaction, but on values. So at some point, I come to a stage where I'm willing to tell the truth, even though I know when I tell the truth, I'm going to find myself in hot water with somebody. Or if I tell the truth, I'm going to disappoint somebody. If I act a certain way, I'm not necessarily going to get praise. I may even get opposition or criticism. In other words, I no longer steer my life by how do I please people, but I steer my life by how do I live so as to embody the values that I hold on to. But there's another kind of moral conversion, and it's what I call critical moral conversion. This is the movement from satisfaction to value. That's the uncritical conversion. What doesn't get resolved is, am I adopting the values of other people? So many people in our society basically simply adopt the values of that society. It's why in America, you often encounter people who cannot distinguish between legality and morality. If this is the law, that's the right thing to do. And if it's not the law, it's the wrong thing to do. The values I live by is what society tells me are right and wrong, legal or illegal. And the idea of someone breaking the law for a higher value makes no sense to such a person. Value is what society says is important. Or it may be that I do what I do because the church says this is what's important. And I live by the values that the church tells me I have to live by. Or I live by the values of my parents. I simply internalize my father or my mother's value system. I just become a younger version of them in terms of what I value and what I believe. Critical moral conversion is a movement from the value of others to the values I actually say, this is what deeply matters to me. This is how I have to live in order to be true to myself as best I can know myself. This is the Socratic moment. Do I really know myself? For the adult to be truly moral in the deepest sense of the term, what is necessary is that you and I assume responsibility for the norms and the standards by which I am willing to be judged. And even if my society condemns me, I am going to hold on to the values I hold on to. This is the moral move of the prophets in biblical literature. This is the moral move of people who are willing to stand up and condemn a law as being an unjust law. That it's not I who have to change, it's the society that has to change. So, for instance, I remembered, I'll tell you a quick story before we move on. I was working with a group of sisters in Washington, D.C. many years ago when I was teaching in Washington before I went up to Boston. And I was sort of like a kind of quasi chaplain and advisor to them. And they were going through reforms and renewals of their life after Vatican II. Their community at the time was a very stringent community. Their whole day was sort of mapped out for them. Certain time, the bell rang, everyone had to get up at the same time. There was a certain amount of time you had to sort of dress and wash up, and then you had to be in chapel, and then you had to have prayer, and then you all went together and you ate. And then after you ate, you had a little bit of time to go back to your room, and then a bell would ring again, and it was time to go off and teach in the school. And the whole day was pretty much like this. It was a very regulated and rather detailed daily schedule that everybody in the community lived by. And then comes Vatican II and this invitation to people to sort of renew their religious life and to think of what it means to really be a sister and a mature woman in the church today and the like. And no surprise, there was a sort of, to this kind of extreme regimentation, there was something of an overreaction to, they just wiped the schedule out. It just was, do what you want to do. And it became almost this other sort of style of life in which everyone followed their own daily pattern of life. And what they began to find was, gee, I'm not seeing the people I'm living with because we're not together for meals at the same time. Some of us are eating early, some of us are eating late. We rarely get together and pray as a group. We may be praying individually, but we're not really meeting and all together and praying together. Or we're not really at night coming together and say, having an hour of just talking with each other and relaxing in each other's company and enjoying the pleasure of good conversation. What they began to find was the community was sort of falling apart because they didn't have any kind of common life anymore. So then after that reaction, a few years later, they rewrite their sort of life plan and they put back community prayer, and they put back community meals, and they put back community recreation. And I remember I was telling somebody about this experience, and this person sort of said, so the whole thing was a waste of time because they started over here, they threw it all out, they were over here for a while, and now they're back where they were. They said, so why did they even start the process? And I remember saying to the person who was criticizing them for this, I said, you don't understand. Now the schedule is their schedule. The schedule is not something imposed by a mother superior on the rest of the community. The schedule is not something from some edict from their general superior in Europe telling them this is how they must live. Rather, they have developed a schedule that comes out of their own sense of themselves, what matters to them, that how they want to live community life together. And they've seen that there are benefits to having some regimentation in order for them to actually live out the values they want to live by. And it's a world of difference if that schedule is imposed by somebody else upon them that they just follow because that person's the boss, or whether it's a schedule that I have come to see. I want this schedule and need it if I'm going to have the values that I say I want to have as a woman religious. It may be superficially from the outside, you look at it and say, the schedule is pretty similar, but the reasons for the schedule are dramatically different. So why is that important that one go through critical moral conversion? Well, I'm going to suggest to you it's critically important because of the world that you and I live in today. Years ago, when people lived in a small village or a neighborhood in a city, and you pretty much lived your life within a fairly enclosed realm where people basically saw the same people and interacted with the same people day in, day out, for weeks, for months, for years. People may have been born in the same town and died in that town. They met their future spouse in that town. They all went to school together. They worked at the local businesses that were in the town or on the farms on the outskirts of town. In other words, there were times in human history when people have lived and the world of experience was rather, one might say, rather contained. And you lived oftentimes in communities that all pretty much thought alike. There was a lot of groupthink, right? They were, oh, that's a Catholic neighborhood, or, oh, that's where the Lutherans are, living up in that part of the state. Right? That you began to live in a world where everyone around you pretty much supported and ratified your values. In that world, you can get by with uncritical moral conversion because the values that you've taken from others go unchallenged, and you can simply follow along and get along with people, and it works pretty well. But now you and I live in a world where, you turn on the TV and you can see 25 different alternative lifestyles. You read a newspaper and you can see all kinds of conflicting opinions and arguments and debates. You live in a world where you're rubbing shoulder with your next door neighbor who may not only not be Catholic or even Christian, but not even a believer. You may be living in an area where there are college kids around who have very different lifestyles. In other words, you stay in an enclosed world and uncritical moral conversion, you could pretty much function in that world. But in a world like the world we live in today, of such diversity, a world of such great pluralism of ideas, of competing value systems, of competing possibilities for lifestyles and the like, if you don't know what you believe, if you don't know what really matters to you, you're out there and you're going to be pushed and pulled in all sorts of directions. This is what I've seen for all these years as an educator on college campuses. I can't tell you the number of conversations over the years I've had with parents who come up and they'll say to me, oh, Father, we'd like you to meet our daughter. We're dropping her off here at Boston College. Oh, she's so thrilled to be here, Father. And she's very involved in the Big Sisters program at home. She's going to want to be in the Big Sisters program here. And she sings in the choir back in the parish. She'll probably want to join the liturgical choir here on campus. Oh, and Father, do you have, a club that does this and, visits shut-ins and, helps elderly people? Oh, I'm sure our daughter would like to do that. She was involved with that in her confirmation class. And I stand there and I say, oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Your daughter sounds like, Mother Teresa reborn. And that's great. And we look forward to seeing her. And the next time you see that kid, She's, lying in a corner with a bottle of cheap wine next to her, and she's burping, you know. And she hasn't been inside the campus ministry the entire semester, right? Why? Because all of a sudden, she's no longer daddy's little girl or mama's little girl. She's no longer shaped by the socially induced identity she had back in her hometown or her own neighborhood. Now she's on a campus and she's rooming with people who disagree with her. She's living down the hall from some people who make fun of her if she goes to church on Sunday. She's dealing with professors, some of whom may tell her Christianity is important, and others who will tell her that's just pie in the sky and childlike daydreams. Grow up, kid. In other words, this kid encounters challenges and alternatives to the world she knew. And if she doesn't start working out, who am I really? She's going to spend 4 years of confusion. She's going to spend 4 years being blown about by the wind, and she's thinking whatever the last person she spoke to thinks. If she's going to be a mature person in a pluralistic, diverse world, it's crucial that we move to critical moral conversion, that we know who we are and we know what we value and what we want to live by. I'm going to skip this last line. Conversion is a shift in horizon for the sake of time. It's not absolutely crucial. Dave, let's go to the last
Okay.
point. Let me just say a word here in closing about the manifestations of conversion. What I mean by that is this. At different points in our life, you and I may experience conversion as asking different things of us. Sometimes conversion in my life is really an invitation for me to repent from some sinfulness that I have, to forsake some lifestyle choices that have got me into a bad situation, or to change some relationships that are unhealthy for me. Sometimes conversion for me is going to be, look, we're doing okay. You're on the right path, but maybe you could pick up the pace a little bit. Maybe you could stop walking and start jogging. Maybe it's time for a little bit more growth in your life, a little more intensification in the relationship you have with the Lord. Sometimes what conversion may ask me to do is stand up against some communities of which I'm part, to be able to stand up and say, you know what, Uncle Joe, the things you're saying are really offensive to me because they're really racist or they're really sexist. And that's not who I am. And I don't appreciate hearing that sitting around the Thanksgiving table. So what's asked of us at different points and times in our life may change. But how do we know if we are in a good way in terms of the process of conversion? Now, there's all kinds of, tests one could try, but I have found for myself the best sign, to me at least, about whether I'm undergoing conversion is really to ask about the relationships in my life. Are my relationships with others deepening? Are my relationships with others, including other human beings and God, are they growing? Or is there stagnation? Is there a demise in a relationship? Now, because you and I are embodied people, we're flesh and blood, we're people of our senses, we never experience conversion simply in our heads. It's not just from the neck up that we undergo conversion. We have to give expression to our conversion. We give expression to our identity by our speech and by our actions. It's only when a lover looks into the eyes of the beloved and says, I really think I love you. Oftentimes, that's not only the beloved who finds out how you feel, sometimes it's me finding out how I feel. It's by saying it, I actually come to realize, my gosh, I really am in love with that other person. Sometimes we need to act out who we are in order to know who we are. We need to symbolize our interior life. We need to let others know our values and commitments. And so we say words, we perform acts that convey our inner life. We speak words of love, we give gifts to one another, we perform acts that convey to others just how much I cherish and appreciate you. If you look at the New Testament, many communities began making symbols of conversion early on in the history of Christianity. Falling in love with Christ required some gestures, some words, and some symbols to express it. First was the experience of prayer, personal prayer and communal prayer, spending time in prayer with the Lord. But some community prayer became especially important. We called these moments sacraments. And it's the community prayer of baptism and Eucharist became crucial for the community to celebrate in order for the community to know who they were and to what they are committed. But other actions also became necessary. Caring for the members of the community, holding fast to the faith when it became socially unpopular or even became a source of persecution. Refusing to simply be conformed to the ethos of the wider society of the Roman Empire, the willingness to be different than other people in that society. A moral code arose as an expression of being a committed Christian. After a while, we began to realize converted Christians act this way rather than that way. And this is done with the same, you might say, logic that prevails when you realize, if I love you, I act this way toward you rather than that way. If I am married, I don't invite a stranger up to my apartment. If I know who I am, I began to live and act differently because of who I am. And so it became, after a while, morally speaking, the great example of love of Christ became, do you love your neighbor? The way Christians should act towards one another reflects who they say they are. That they are people who have fallen in love with God, and they will love what God loves, other people. Conversion makes demands. We must acknowledge our failures and our sinfulness, demonstrate our regret and our remorse over our failings. But those processes, it's not enough simply to feel guilty. It's also we begin to live differently. Living a converted life means I begin to walk the path of discipleship. And being a disciple requires of us that we stop living out of the false illusions of an unjust society or a society that's preoccupied with self-satisfaction or preoccupied with self-adulation or consumption. Disciples are those who hand their lives over to God, and we're willing to live at some risk by trusting that God is the one who really is the center of our lives. So the converted are those people who are really willing to take the journey of discovering, what do I value? What will I stand by? What will I live by? And be willing to accept the consequences of being true to myself, because I actually know who I am. So Dave, with that, I think maybe we can go to the small
No
group.
breakout rooms. I have pasted into the chat questions. I can read them quickly. Do you think people can dull themselves into a state of mediocrity? Is sloth a real danger in the moral life? Does the idea of critical moral conversion make sense to you? What manifestations of conversion do you think are most important in a person's life? And these are also in your chat. You can go, you check in your chat, and they've already been pasted in there. So let me put the breakout rooms in for about 20 minutes. Give me a moment here. About 10 minutes or so. If anyone has any suggestions, thoughts, reflections, or anything, just raise your hand and I will recognize you for thoughts. Mary, you can unmute yourself and speak.
I just wanted to thank Father and Dave and everyone for putting together such a wonderful program. It's been very inspiring for me, and I greatly appreciate all of your time.
Okay, any others have any thoughts or things that they were struck? Oh, let's see, Joanne?
You got to unmute, Joanne.
Muted.
Yeah,
Actually, that was a clapping, not a hand up. I would echo that, but
oh, okay.
but I would just add that I really would say the part about a critical conversion as opposed to an uncritical really resonated. I was sharing that as the daughter of immigrants, they came to this country and they wanted to be in this country, but they wanted to hang on to this culture. So we were Italian and everyone else was Metagana, and we shouldn't be like them. But then suddenly I was in school and Metaganas weren't that bad, and I kind of wanted to be a little bit like them, and so I really needed to assert myself, and that that was the beginning.
Yeah.
And I can say there's been points throughout my life, even with Catholicism and some of the things that just in terms of the hierarchical church and being growing up during Vatican II, the thought of going back rather than forward is just not something I could ever abide by. And so a couple of us said in our own group that had I not found St. Vincent's, I'm not sure I would still be a practicing Catholic. So anyway, I would share that. And I echo many thanks to you, Father Himes, and to Dave for all that you do to organize us and keep us. Yeah.
Thank you, Joanne.
Any others would like to reflect on anything about either
Dave.
today or anything else?
Dave,
Yep.
Father Himes, I think the point you were making about the nuns, that you gave the little example about how they got rid of everything and started over again. I think that kind of applies to the larger church, maybe not to the same level because we weren't in intensity of community. But I think for a lot of people, we were given a good foundation of rules and things to believe in our faith. But it was kind of like, unless we understood it in a different way, like you're talking about, we never really kind of had the tools to kind of figure it out for ourselves as to how we would come back at it and accept it in a different way later on. And I think I was saying in the group, I think I'm still purging some of the things that I was taught to see them in a different way, in a positive way, so that we accept where, what we were taught, but we accept it on our own vision, perhaps. And I like to use, Matthew Fox phrase, just changing the idea of original sin to original blessing without rejecting that, it's an entirely different way of looking at things, you know, to think that you're in the image of God, that we're not always looking at ourselves as being sinners and there's penalties for everything we do.
Mhm. Yeah, you know, I had a, I'm sorry.
Go on.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Ruthie.
Oh, I just was gonna say, I feel like I just got a free course in moral theology from Boston College. It was great. So helpful. Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Very
Okay, anybody else has anything to say? I thank Father Ken for his work today and all that he's done today in the last two sessions, been very helpful. I'm putting a plug in about a month, you'll be having an adult faith formation survey. So please, when you see the emails, respond to it because it helps us give us information on the sort of things you want us to show in the next year and the coming years and other suggestions you might have. So I'll say that, and I say a very good night. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Everybody.
everybody.
Great. So,
Good night. Thank you.
thank you.